St. Mark's, may the peace of Christ be with you all. There's a busy intersection in downtown New York City with a lot of things going on. Here's a picture of that intersection looking down from high above, giving you kind of a bird's eye perspective. Every single day at this intersection, hundreds, if not thousands, of cars, buses, and taxis pass through this very intersection. Then there are pedestrians as well as people on bikes on their morning commute. There's construction going on one of the street corners. There's a hot dog vendor, if you look closely, on another. Then there are people at a bus stop waiting for the bus to arrive on another corner. But from this high up above the city, it might be hard to notice all of that because the people down below look like ants and the traffic looks like a constant flowing river, and all of the street noise from down below sounds like a distant hum. But if you were to stand, say, at street level, the perspective would look a little bit different, maybe something like this next picture. And you would start to notice things that you didn't notice from high up above. From a street level perspective, details start to emerge. You could see people's facial expressions as they quickly walk by you. You can hear what conversations they're having on their cell phones. You could feel the rumble of the subway as it passes beneath your feet. You could smell the hot dogs. Did any of you notice that yellow taxi right there in the middle of the street? Well, imagine what it would be like being a passenger inside. The perspective from inside that yellow taxi cab might look like the picture above me, a small little window to see what's going on outside. And since the taxi driver is driving as fast as he can, things are passing by kind of like a blur. There's no time to take in the sights. You're in a taxi, not a tour bus. And since the clock is ticking and the meter is running, you just want to get to your destination. One final perspective. A very busy intersection in downtown New York City looks very much different for a group of people waiting at a bus stop. Who knows how long they've been standing there, apparently in cold weather. Those are snowbanks behind them. Who knows what each one of them has had to endure? Some of them are looking down the street trying to catch a glimpse of the bus. A few of them are looking at the bus schedule that's posted there, wondering if they're at the right bus stop. One guy is on his phone letting his friends know that he'll be running late. One girl is looking at the crosswalk sign, wondering if she should just walk home. The perspective of a very busy street corner for a group of people who are waiting for a bus is entirely different than for someone, say, inside of a taxi. These people have been waiting a long time, but soon their wait will be over because just around the corner, their bus is about to arrive. A single intersection in downtown New York City on any given day of the year, depending on where you're standing, will determine what you see. From high up above, you get sort of a bird's eye perspective. From the street level below, you see a lot more details. From inside of a speeding taxi, the details are kind of a blur, and while waiting at a bus stop with nothing but time on your hands, you start to notice things because time seems to stand still. 4 different perspectives of the same intersection, 4 different views from 4 different angles. So what does my introduction have anything to do with Jesus? It's a valid question. Well, the illustration that I just shared with you is just one way how to explain why we have 4 different Gospels at the beginning of the New Testament. One Gospel gives you sort of a bird's eye perspective. Another gospel gives you a street level perspective. Another gospel wants to get you from point A to point B as quick as fast and possible. And yet another gospel was written by someone who was waiting around for a long time. Welcome to a new sermon series this morning on the four gospels, the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This morning, I'll spend some time sharing some general comments about all four of the Gospels, and with the time remaining, we'll just scratch the surface on the Gospel of Matthew. We have four scripture passages this morning, which are the opening verses of each of the four Gospels. I'll be reading from the NIV translation. The page numbers are included in your bulletins, but please feel free to follow on the screen above me. Our first passage is from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 1, verse 1. Let us prepare our hearts and minds for the reading of God's word. The genealogy of Jesus. A record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Our second passage is from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 1, verse 1. John the Baptist prepares the way. The beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Our third passage is from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Introduction. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the first, were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Our fourth and final passage is from the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. The Word became flesh. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. These are the words of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The opening verses of each of the four Gospels already tells us what they wanted to say about Jesus Christ. In Matthew's Gospel, for example, he began with a genealogy of Jesus, and he started with the name Abraham, and then 42 names later, 42 generations later, we finally get to Jesus Christ. But thanks to Matthew's opening verse, we don't have to read all 42 names because Matthew drops the two biggest names right there in his opening introduction, the names David and Abraham. And if you were Jewish, which most of, if not all of Matthew's audience was, that's all you really needed to hear. I'll keep my comments brief about Matthew for now. We'll come back to him in a moment later. But Matthew, if you recall from the last sermon series, was actually an eyewitness because he was one of the original 12 disciples, and his gospel comes first in the order of the four gospels because it serves sort of like as a literary bridge between the Old Testament and the New. Matthew's gospel served as a connection between the people of God and their history with God to the present and to the person of Jesus Christ. In other words, Matthew's gospel connected Judaism to Jesus, and so what you see in his gospel oftentimes are constant references and quotes from the Old Testament prophets. Then you get to see how those prophecies were fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. So it's safe to say that Matthew saw Jesus through the lens of the Old Testament. That picture you saw earlier of people waiting at a bus stop, that's Matthew's gospel. Only in Matthew's gospel, his people weren't waiting for a bus. They were waiting for the Messiah. And the good news in Matthew's gospel was that their wait was finally over, for in Jesus Christ, God's promises were fulfilled and the Messiah had finally arrived. Then there's the Gospel of Mark. The perspective from Mark's gospel was kind of like if you were sitting inside of a speeding taxi. Because in Mark's gospel, the storyline moves very quickly, so if you're going to read Mark's gospel, make sure to fasten your seatbelts. In fact, Mark's gospel is sometimes called in some circles the action gospel because Mark wants to take you from point A to point B as quick as possible. You know this because when you read Mark's gospel, he uses these certain words that none of the other gospel writers use. It's the words immediately or at once, kind of like he was in a rush to tell the story. There's no time in Mark's gospel for long and lengthy genealogies. There's no time for long discussions and discourses and stories. In Mark's gospel, it's rapid-fire succession of short little bursts and stories. Mark's gospel, by the way, is also the shortest among the four gospels, but don't let that fool you. Even though it's the shortest, he has the most number of miracles that Jesus performs, and that's because Mark wants to portray Jesus, like in his opening introduction, as the Son of God who has come to do the work and the will of the Father. Then there's the Gospel of Luke. Listen again to Luke's opening introduction. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also for me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Luke obviously was the intellectual one among the four gospel writers, which you probably picked up just by the way he wrote his introduction. Luke, in his opening introduction, used more words than any other gospel writer. There's a saying, how you can say about someone, he used 100 words when he could have just used 10. That's the Gospel of Luke. But Luke's gospel is that street-level perspective of Jesus Christ. Luke wants you to see with your own eyes, hear with your own ears, feel with your own hands what was going on. He wants you to see Jesus interact with everyday people on the street. He wants you to hear Jesus and the conversations that he has with all the people. So Luke slows things down. He takes the time to record even the smallest of details. He even goes the extra mile to point out Jesus reaching out to the marginalized, the destitute, the poor, the widow, the lame, and the outsiders. And maybe because Luke himself was not a Jew, he wanted to show Jesus was for all people. An interesting thing about Luke was the only non-Jew to contribute a book in the New Testament. And finally, there's the Gospel of John. John's Gospel, John's perspective of and on the person of Jesus Christ was different than the other three. Even in his opening verse, you can tell right away, this gospel is going to be different. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. The perspective from John's gospel is kind of like that high above, bird's eye looking down perspective on the person of Jesus Christ. So that's why in a lot of artwork, the symbol for the Gospel of John is often an eagle And in his presentation of Jesus, he wants you to see a bird's eye view, something completely different that no one's seen before. So rather than focus on the entire life and journey of Jesus Christ, the birth, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, John focuses primarily just on 3 short weeks in Jesus' life, and then he explores them in great detail. John wanted you to know who Jesus is, not necessarily his background, where he came from. So in John's gospel, you're going to find those famous verses called the I am sayings. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. I am the true light. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. I am the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. That's just a quick snapshot of each of the 4 Gospels, 4 different perspectives from 4 different angles. Now, I want to spend the rest of my time saying a little bit more about the Gospel according to Matthew. And as I said earlier, Matthew's Gospel comes first in the order of the Gospels because his Gospel serves as that bridge between the Old and the New Testaments. But Matthew's gospel also played a very important role in the life of the early church because the majority of folks who made up the early church were all from Jewish backgrounds. And so in Matthew's gospel, there was this cultural sensitivity to what most people had experienced. And that was really important if you were a Jew who was converting to Christianity. Can you sort of grasp how important that might have been in the first century? Matthew knew their stories. It was his story too. Matthew knew the Jewish history. It was his own history too. That's why when he started his gospel, he starts with a genealogy. There's a picture on the cover of our bulletin. If we could put it on the screen. Do you recognize what this is? This is our first gospel window. These are our 4 gospel windows, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is a picture of the top one, the Gospel of Matthew. Might be hard for you to see where it is on a bright day. The light just comes in. It's to take a picture. It's kind of blurry, but we took a picture late in the afternoon and we blew it up for you. What do you notice about the image of Matthew's gospel window? What do you see? It's a man. Other than the colors, it's a person, a man. The symbol for Matthew's gospel is the image of a man. Some of you may remember this booklet. It is a booklet on the symbolism in St. Mark's Presbyterian Church. And listen to what is written inside about Matthew's gospel window. The man is used to represent St. Matthew because his gospel deals with the human genealogy of Jesus and emphasizes Jesus' humanity throughout. That's a very important description of the gospel window, captured by an image of a man. Genealogies were important for the readers of Matthew's gospel, or another way to say it might be where you came from, who your ancestors were. In other words, your lineage. All those things were very important for Matthew's community. You could put the picture down. Almost 30 years ago, when I graduated from seminary, my first call was to a church up in downtown LA. It was primarily an immigrant church made up of first-generation immigrants from Korea. So On any given Sunday, it was not uncommon for an older member of the church to come up to me and ask in Korean, "What is your father's name?" I don't think anyone here asks that question, but in my first church, in that kind of cultural context, that was a very common question. And if I answered that correctly, not hard to do, there's a follow-up question. Where are you from? Meaning, what is your family's hometown? Where is your village located back in Korea? These were questions about lineage. I haven't told this story in a while, but there was this church gathering in my very first year at that church where the entire session, elders, more than 45 of them, the entire pastoral staff, full-time staff, there was 14 of us, and all of our spouses, we were invited to a kind of an annual dinner. It was actually a birthday dinner hosted by one of the oldest members who was a founding member of that church. So Sunday evening, we're all at his house. There's more than 100 of us there at that dinner gathering. I'm bumping into things. This is my first year. I don't know what's going on. I'm the new guy, the rookie, the guy nobody knows. I was invisible, and it didn't help that I barely spoke Korean. So I'm just looking to eat and go. That's when the host, an older gentleman, he must have been in his late 80s. This is 30 years ago. He comes up and sits right next to me during dinner, and then he starts talking about my grandfather, his childhood friend. I heard stories about my grandfather I had never heard before in my life. This elder, who is one of the founding members of this particular church, reminiscing for more than 30 minutes of the good old days and his childhood life with my grandfather, talking about him in casual tones, and he was saying this out loud in front of the entire gathering. What that elder did was, well, one, it was very sentimental, but more than that, what he was doing was he was connecting me to a very important past. What I noticed afterwards was that people started treating me differently. Instead of this nobody, this rookie who's going to be gone in 6 months, they started treating me like family, like I was one of their own. That's what Matthew was doing by starting his gospel with a genealogy, by letting everyone know, especially in this small-knit Jewish community, that you and Jesus, you both share this royal heritage. You share this amazing lineage. You share this with the person of Jesus Christ and vice versa. And by dropping all of those names from Abraham to David and from David to Jesus and all those names in between, your past is connected to the present and you are part of God's family. And so is he. That was important because Jews were rejecting Jesus as the Messiah. So genealogies and what they represented were important in Matthew's gospel. That's an understatement. The other big thing that was important in Matthew's gospel then were all the prophecies, all the old sayings, the quotes from all those names that we sometimes have a hard time remembering from the Old Testament and how they pointed to Jesus Christ. So what you see in Matthew's gospel are all these references where Matthew would say things like, as it was foretold, as the prophets have spoken, and then he would show how those prophecies were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. One clear example of a prophetic quote that stands out in Matthew's gospel is the one from the triumphal entry in Matthew chapter 21. opening verses. Here's Matthew. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophets. And then here comes the quotes. Say to the daughters of Zion, a quote within a quote, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey, Zechariah. And then lo and behold, there's this image coming down the hillside. It's Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, fulfilling what the prophets had just spoken. Well, not just spoken, but fulfilling what the prophets said long ago. Just one example. So there's all these quotes about the coming Messiah who would save God's people, all these quotes about the future king of Israel. So then it's no wonder in the opening chapter of Matthew's gospel, we see magi, wise men, the three kings of the Orient coming to Jerusalem to pay homage to the newborn king of Israel. That imagery plays heavy for Matthew's people. All those prophetic quotes, all those old sayings were very important to Matthew's people. So that's what Matthew was working with. He was dealing with a group of people for whom the past meant almost everything, and he was helping them to make a connection to the present and to the person of Jesus Christ. He was also, through his gospel, helping his people who are sort of stuck in the past. You know those people. He was helping them who were stuck in the past to embrace this new thing, this new movement called Christianity. That's why only in Matthew's gospel we have that part in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, that whole entire section where Jesus says words like, you have heard that it was said long ago, but I say to you this new thing. For example, you have heard that it was said to a people long ago, do not murder. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Matthew 5:21. Again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, do not break your oaths, but I tell you, do not swear at all. Verse 34. You have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person, turn the other cheek. Verse 38, 34. Matthew wanted to show how Jesus was teaching the people that the old sayings now have new meaning, and for them to move beyond the past and to live in present grace and to be transformed by the love of God which Jesus embodied. For the people of God who had been waiting for a long time for the Messiah to finally arrive, seeing the birth of Christ was the best news they had ever heard. No more waiting for deliverance, for the time of salvation had come. No more waiting for the Messiah, for God is with us, Emmanuel. And all God's people said,